My Thanksgiving prank backfired. It ended our relationship forever. I just wanted to do something nice and intricate for my husband on Thanksgiving because he loves the holiday. But if I'd have known that my planning would lead to the end of my marriage, I would have just stuck with a plain dinner instead. My name is Stacy Collins, female 26, and I've been married to Jared, male 27, for 2 years now. He's everything I could have ever hoped for in a partner and more. We met when I was in my first year of university through a mutual friend, but we didn't hit it off right away. We were kind of like acquaintances who tried to be cordial with each other for the sake of the friend we both shared. I didn't have something against him or anything. We were just very different people. Our awkward relationship continued throughout university. It was weird because we saw each other almost everywhere because of our mutual friend, but we never got close or even talked long enough to actually get to know each other. Years later, while I was doing my rounds at the general hospital I worked at, I saw him. He'd been admitted after a hyperglycemic episode, he's diabetic, and was preparing to leave when I walked in. I didn't recognize him at first, so I'd scolded him about trying to leave without being properly discharged first, and then we'd gotten into an argument. We were practically in the middle of a shouting match when he suddenly paused and asked what my name was, and after I told him, he started laughing. After we figured out that we knew each other and I confirmed his discharge, we spent my lunch break catching up in the hospital's cafeteria. I found out that he was a teacher and that he'd been so stressed out that he'd missed his insulin shots. I hadn't seen him in a few years at this point, so there was a lot of catching up to do. I told him about my last year of nursing school and how I'd started working at the hospital. We talked for so long that it felt like hours, and I felt almost sad when I had to get back to work. We'd known each other for years, but we'd never actually had a full-on conversation. Talking to him felt so easy and fun, and it turned out that we had more in common than I thought. We'd just never spoken enough to realize it. That night, he called to ask if I'd want to get coffee sometime, and I said yes. We met a few days later at a small cafe near the hospital, and before we both knew it, we were spending all our lunch breaks together. Luckily, the cafe was between the hospital and the school, which made it easy for us to meet up every day and spend time together. In a matter of weeks, we were spending time together outside of lunch breaks, meeting after work, and planning nights out. I was completely surprised by how we'd known each other for so long and had never actually gotten to know each other. I'd completely misjudged him. Jared was a bit of an introvert, and he always kept to himself whenever we hung out. And I just believed that he was stuck up, and that he thought he was better than everyone, but it wasn't true at all. He turned out to be the sweetest guy and a bit of a nerd too, obsessed with all things historical and old. We'd been dating for almost a year before he proposed. He proposed to me after a trip to Italy, which was somewhere he knew I'd always wanted to visit, and of course, it didn't hurt that there were a bunch of old ruins he could gush over too. There were tears in my eyes when I said yes, and watched as he slid the ring onto my finger. We got married a few months later in front of both of our families, and it was honestly the best day of my life. I couldn't believe my life had changed so much as I walked down the aisle and listened to the priest officiate us. I cried again as he said his vows. I do that a lot because I'm a water sign. And I said mine, and then we were married. We're both lucky enough to have good relationships with each other's parents, so the wedding was truly an amazing day for everyone. We spent our honeymoon in Africa, mostly in Egypt, because he'd always wanted to see the pyramids and other ancient sites. I wasn't too excited about spending our honeymoon looking at old rocks, but it was surprisingly a great time. All the sights that we saw were so beautiful, despite them being hundreds of years old. We got to cruise the Nile, visit actual tombs and burial sites, and we even took a drive through the Sahara. It was all so amazing. A few weeks after we got back, we finally moved in together. I was tired of constantly having to go back and forth between his place and mine, and he wanted us to be closer together. So I moved in with him, and after a year of living together, we got our own place. Still an apartment, although we were trying to save up for a house, but one that was a lot bigger and gave us more room. I thought I'd finally gotten the life I'd always wanted. A nice apartment, a great husband, and a stable job. But it all came crashing down around me in November, when Thanksgiving rolled around. It's been Jared's favorite holiday since when he was a kid, probably because of the turkey and all the food. And even though he now knows the less than colorful history behind it all, it's still his preferred holiday. I'd originally planned to do something for him and set up a nice dinner, but everything changed when our old friend moved back to the city. That mutual friend I mentioned before, the one that introduced Jared and I to each other in the first place? Yeah, his name is Mark, and the two of us had been friends since we were in high school. We met during auditions for the school play. I was a bit of a theater kid in my teens, and we quickly became best friends. We did absolutely everything together and spent all our days together. When we weren't in school, we were constantly talking on the phone and planning what we would do when we were in school. We were totally inseparable, so much so that we even went to the same university where I met Jared. Mark and Jared were childhood best friends who were briefly separated during high school, but they rekindled their relationship in university. After uni, Mark moved to a different city for med school, and our relationship kind of suffered. We tried to stay close, but it was hard because of the distance. And when I got with Jared, we both agreed that maybe it was best if our relationship wasn't as close or intense as it used to be. So I limited communication and didn't reach out as much, and it got to the point where we barely spoke. It was hard at first because we'd been friends for so long, and we were so close, but I convinced myself it was what was best for my relationship. And looking back now, I think maybe I should have kept things the way they were. If I'm being honest, there's a bit more to the story. The reason Jared suggested that I limit contact with Mark is because one night, when I'd had too much to drink, I'd confessed to him that things between me and Mark had gotten romantic for a brief period during our last year of high school. It was never anything serious, and it didn't last long at all. But because of that, and the way I was always talking about him, Jared became convinced that I must still harbor feelings for him. I tried to convince him that I didn't, but he'd already made up his mind. Up until late October, I hadn't spoken to Mark in a few months, but then he messaged me and told me he was moving back to the city for his residency. He also suggested that we do something special for Mark, since Thanksgiving was his favorite holiday. I hadn't spoken to him in months, and hadn't seen him in longer, so it didn't take much convincing for me to agree to the plan. Since it would have also been the first Mark and Jared were seeing each other in months, he, Mark, decided that we should pull a prank on him on Thanksgiving, one that would end in a kind of get-together party with our friends. I picked him up from the airport, and it immediately felt like I was 17 again when we saw each other. We hugged for what felt like hours before we stopped at a coffee shop to talk. The catching up didn't last long, though, because we had just a few weeks to plan before it was Thanksgiving, so we quickly started to work out how things were going to go. The planning took a while, and I found myself lying to my husband as I snuck out of the apartment late at night. I could tell he was starting to get suspicious. Not just that something was going on, but of me as well, but I brushed it off, thinking that what we're doing was so ridiculous, and that when he knew what was actually going on, he'd feel silly for ever suspecting anything in the first place. But then, one night at Mark's new apartment, after an afternoon of working out the details of the prank and the party, we decided to watch a movie to relax. We ended up on his couch, sitting pretty close together, and I didn't think much of it since we'd spent countless nights watching movies huddled together on his bed as teens. But then he inched closer to me. I still didn't pay attention to it. We'd been that close before. But soon we were pressed together without an inch of space between us, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I turned to him to let him know that I should probably start heading home, but then he cupped my cheek and kissed me. I'd told Jared over and over that there was nothing between me and Mark, and that we were just close friends, but at that moment I started to doubt my words because before I knew it, I was kissing him back. After a few seconds, I pulled back, surprised that he'd just done that, but even more surprised at my reaction. I knew I'd just done something horrible, but I couldn't bring myself to leave, and against my better judgment, I leaned in and kissed him again. I don't know why I did it. Maybe to test if what I was feeling was actually true, or to shock myself into getting out of his apartment. I don't know. But I didn't leave. Despite everything in me screaming that I had to get out of there, I didn't leave. One thing led to another, and soon enough, I was in bed with my best friend. I felt awful about it once it was over, and I left immediately, but it didn't stop me from going back. I convinced myself that I was only going back to continue with our plans, and I told Mark that it could never happen again, but despite everything, it did. We spent the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving not only planning the prank, but also sneaking around. I felt awful each time and would promise myself never to do it again, but I would break that promise each time I saw him. I don't understand why it all happened. If I were to try and excuse my actions, I'd blame it on the long hours I spent in the hospital. Going over to Mark's place afterwards felt like such a relief. He was a much-needed break after all the time I spent working, and Jared was busy at the time due to exams coming up for his students, so I spent almost all my free time with Mark. It is the only thing I can think of that makes sense for why I did what I did. But I don't want to make excuses for myself. I did something wrong, and I can, at the very least, admit that. Thanksgiving got closer and closer, and I started to notice something off about Mark. He would start to make strange comments about Jared and ask about the state of my relationship with him, something we'd agreed we wouldn't do once things between us started. He would suggest that we just get together instead, and it started as a joke at first, but then toward the end, he started to seem serious. He would suggest it to me, and then send me messages about it. The night before the party, after we'd slept together, he confessed to me that the prank was just an excuse, and that he had come back to be with me. He told me that he'd been in love with me since when we were teenagers, but he'd ignored his feelings because he thought I didn't feel the same way. He'd come back to see if the way I'd felt about him had changed despite me being married to his best friend. And that night, weeks ago when I'd slept with him, he became convinced that I must feel the same way. I tried to explain to him that he had the wrong idea, but he was convinced that I was in love with him too. I made a mistake, a horrible one, I know, but it was still just a mistake. I love my husband more than anything in the world, and it took Mark's confession for me to see that I would rather be with him than anyone else. I ended things with Mark that night. His confession had set my head straight, and the guilt had gotten too much for me to handle, but he spent the night blowing up my phone with messages and calls, trying to get me to reconsider. I let him know that I would be going ahead with the plans without him, and that he shouldn't call me again or come near Jared and I. I thought that that would be the end of things, which I know was naive, but I just wanted things to be over. When I got back to the apartment that night, and saw the sleepy look on Jared's face as he answered the door, he always waited up for me despite me telling him not to, I felt dirty and awful. I couldn't believe I'd let Mark almost ruin the beautiful relationship I'd found with Jared. I blocked Mark's number before I went to bed that night and hoped he would listen to me and stay away. I spent Thanksgiving morning riddled with anxiety. I kept glancing at the door as I prepared the food and snacks for the party, but Mark never showed up. After the prank went off without a hitch, and Mark still hadn't shown his face, I started to think that everything was fine, that I'd managed to erase my mistake, but I was wrong. Jared took care of greeting our friends at the door, while I stayed in the kitchen to bring everything out and arrange all the food. I was so busy that I'd completely forgotten that I'd left my phone on the coffee table. Jared told me it was ringing, but I just assumed it was my parents or siblings calling to wish me a happy Thanksgiving, so I told him to ignore it. I thought he had. I wished that he had, but he didn't. The party was great. Everyone had a nice time and complimented the food. It was a great way for both Jared and I to wind down after the stress from our jobs and have some fun. We spent the night eating food and playing games, before ending it by saying what we were grateful for. I'd noticed throughout the night that Jared seemed a bit off. He was his usual quiet self, but he barely smiled or paid attention during the games. It was when he opted out of saying what he was grateful for, even after I'd talked about how I was grateful for our marriage and relationship, that I knew something was wrong, and I watched him say goodbye to our friends with my heart in my mouth. When the last of them had left, he turned to me and without saying a word, reached for my phone. We both knew each other's passwords. That was how close and trusting we were with each other, and pulled up the messages between me and Mark. He then revealed that he'd answered the phone when it kept ringing, and that it had been Mark on the other end, using a different number since I'd blocked his other one. Jared had to listen to Mark's begging for a whole minute before he told him that it was him that had answered the phone and not me, and then warned him against calling me or ever coming near us again. He calmly asked me to explain what was going on, and I was crying before I even started talking. I know it must have made me look even guiltier, but I couldn't help it. I just felt so horrible about the whole thing, and I couldn't believe what I had done. I asked him to sit down first, and he agreed without arguing, but his calmness made me feel even worse and more anxious. I told him about the whole thing, about how it had started when we planning the party, and about Mark's confession, but I tried to make it clear to him that what happened with Mark was only ever about relieving stress from work, and that I was sure now that he was the one I wanted to be with. He said nothing for the longest time, just stared straight ahead at the table, and when he finally did speak, it was to ask if I'd lied to him before, when I'd told him that I didn't have feelings for Mark. I told him that I didn't, that even now, after everything that's happened, I still didn't have feelings for him. He nodded his head at my response and then gently told me that he was leaving and that he'd be back tomorrow for his things. Hearing that felt like the world had stopped spinning, and it knocked the air right out of my chest. I begged and pleaded with him to reconsider and change his mind, but he didn't budge. I tried to hold him as I cried for forgiveness, but each time he just removed my hands and placed them back in my lap. I couldn't let him leave. I knew in the back of my mind that him leaving now could mean the end of our marriage, so I continued begging. I tried to convince him to let us talk about it and for me to try and explain why I did what I did, even though I still didn't fully understand it myself. But he just told me that there was nothing to talk about and that there was nothing I could say to make him stay. He needed space and time away from me. I understood that. I'd betrayed him and risked our marriage for something insignificant. It made sense that he needed time away to think, so I made him promise that when he came back the next day, we would talk. I made him promise that he wouldn't let this stupid mistake ruin the years that we'd spent together, and he agreed. He nodded his head, and when I released his hands, he got up and headed for our bedroom. I watched him pack a small bag with tears in my eyes, and I said goodbye to him at the door, but he didn't say anything back. I could barely get any sleep that night, too anxious about what would happen the next day. The next morning, I waited in the living room for him, and when I heard the key in the door, I practically ran to it because I was so anxious to see him and to fix things. But it wasn't him at the door. It was his brother. He'd come to collect most of Jared's things. When I asked him where Jared was and why he wasn't here himself, he wouldn't give me a straight answer and just marched into our apartment. He packed up most of Jared's things as I watched. I continued asking questions, but most of them went unanswered or answered in a way that didn't tell me much of anything. By the time he was done and ready to go, it was clear to me that Jared had just told me he would be coming back, so I would let him go. He had just told me what I'd wanted to hear. I tried not to panic and instead told myself that he was just taking the space we had agreed on and that there was nothing to worry about. Soon he would be back, and then we could have a proper conversation about what comes next. But after days turned into a full week, I started to panic and fear the worst. I was so scared that I couldn't hold back anymore. I knew the only other place that Jared could have gone was his brother's house. He tried to avoid going to his parents when he could. So I went there after work and tried to speak to him. He had opened the door like he was expecting me. And right there, in the doorway of his brother's apartment, he told me that he wanted a divorce and that I could keep staying in the apartment until the lease was up, but that when the papers came, I needed to sign them and there was no changing his mind. It's been weeks now, and no matter how hard I've tried to reach out, I've heard nothing back. He won't answer my calls or respond to my texts. I've tried to reach him through his family, but they all seem to want nothing to do with me. I know he must have already told them about what I did. I've even tried to speak to him at his school, but the security there is pretty tight. I can't get through unless I work there, am a parent, or if someone inside has already cleared my visit. He hasn't blocked my number yet. I know that because my calls keep going through, and my texts are getting sent. At first, that gave me hope that he might still want to hear from me, but after so long without any response, I don't know what to feel anymore. And to make matters worse, Mark hasn't stopped trying to contact me. I've tried to get him to stop, and to explain to him that hanging around me is just going to ruin my chances at saving my marriage, but he just won't give up. This whole thing has just spiraled into one big mess, and I have no idea what I'm going to do. Now that the papers haven't come yet, but it's only a matter of time now before they do, and I don't know how I can fix things before then. Jared is the best thing that's ever happened to me, and I can't lose him over this. How do I get my husband to see that this whole thing was just a mistake? How do I fix my marriage?